During the mid-1980s, the wheels were in motion at the BBC to effectively kill Doctor Who. This would impact the show all the way up until it finished in 1989. Now when you rewatch stories from the mid-1980s, you can see the sudden change of pace from season 23 and 24. And that was a direct response of the 18-month hiatus put in place by controller at the BBC at the time, Michael Grade. Now obviously we know some of the plans for what would have been the original Series 23. And I've always wondered what that would have looked like if we hadn't got the trial of the Time Lord. Much like season 22, the same 45-minute format on a Saturday night, mostly made up of 2-parters and 1 3-parter, would follow suit of this season 23. Now this new season of Who would also include a few more locations, as the opening story was supposed to be set in Blackpool and another story was supposed to be set in Singapore. But to be honest with you, I'd be very surprised if the Singapore location hadn't been moved to somewhere slightly cheaper and somewhere slightly closer to home. Going back to the last story of season 22, Revelation of the Daleks was supposed to lead straight into the opening story of season 23, The Nightmare Fair.
Alright, I'll take you to...
Written by previous producer of the show, Graham Williams, the Doctor and Perry arrive in 1985 Blackpool and come face to face with the Celestial Toymaker, who was supposed to be played by the original actor Michael Gove, who was convinced to return 20 years later after playing the part in the Celestial Toymaker back in 1966. You can listen to this story through the Big Finish adaptation like I have, or you can read the Target novelisation. So there are ways of experiencing this story. And maybe that's why it's one of the best known, just because it's out there to experience. And it might not be in the same format as it would have been if it was seen on television, but there's still a way you can enjoy this story. It is sort of a shame that we don't see this one, that we can't see it, because this would have been one of the only locations where the Doctor's costume probably would have visually looked in place. The second story of the season was titled The Ultimate Evil, written by Wally K. Daly. The Doctor and Perry would arrive on a holiday planet called Tranquilla, where a dwarf Mordant would be using a space ray to infect the inhabitants and turn them into raging violent killers. Now from the writer's room, The Lost Season 23, which you can find on the Season 23 collection set, Wally K. Daly talks about how violent this story would have been. And there's a scene where the Doctor would have been infected himself by this space ray and tried to kill someone using shards of glass. Probably best when you get to see that. Much like The Nightmare Fair, you can experience this story through the Target novelisation or the Big Finish adaptation, which I haven't gotten around to reading or listening to yet, so I haven't really experienced this story. Personally, I'm not too big on the idea of especially the Doctor killing in such a violent way. I feel like this would have been another example of the writing letting down this incarnation and what Colin Baker was trying to bring to the part. Story 3, Yellow Fever and How to Cure It. Written by Doctor Who legend Robert Holmes. So as I mentioned briefly, this story was to be set in Singapore. Now the only reason this was supposed to be set in Singapore was because the producer at the time, John Nathan Turner, went on holiday and brought back some film reels of Singapore. And this story was to feature Holmes' creation, the Autons. It was also going to have the Master or the Rani, or maybe both, as well as the Brigadier. Unfortunately, this story was cancelled quite early on in Robert Holmes' writing process, so apart from the facts I've just talked about, there's not really much else known about this story. Then this story would have been a proper throwback. Having the Doctor interact with the Brigadier, especially this incarnation, probably would have been very enjoyable. Luckily, there is a big finish out there where the Sixth Doctor and the Brigadier do interact. And much like all the other Doctors, they fit together really well. Now, having Anthony Ainley brought on and also interact with the Brigadier as well as the Autons would have been a very interesting dynamic. Anthony Ainley brings his own performance to the Master. And I'm not saying he's any better than Roger Delgado, because Roger Delgado was brilliant. But Anthony Ainley was born to play the Master. So that would have been a very interesting dynamic to watch. Much like the first two stories, Mission to Magnus, written by Philip Martin, was cancelled quite later on in the writing or pre-production process. Therefore, you can listen or read this story either through a Target novelisation or the Big Finish adaptation. There's something about this story which feels very of its time, but not in a good way. Now, from what I can remember, the plot is more or less a planet of boys versus girls. Syl is trying to conduct a business deal with this planet, which then obviously it's all flipped on its head when the Ice Warriors are brought in, as they're trying to tilt the planet's axes to make the environment colder to basically live on this planet, making it habitable for themselves. Which is an interesting idea in itself, but with the other elements of the story, it doesn't really gel together. On top of that, we have another Time Lord called Ansel, who was the Doctor's bully back on Gallifrey. Although I've listened to the Big Finish adaptation, which has been slightly tweaked to modernise it in some ways, it still feels very 80s. The idea of the Doctor having a bully, I think, sort of feels a little bit redundant, and in the first act sort of belittles the character of the Doctor, that is, which is never really enjoyable to listen, read, or let alone see on television. Not your main character. All I'm going to say is, I think what we got instead, which is Mind Warp, which was also written by Philip Martin, is a lot stronger story than what Mission of Magnus would have been if we'd seen it. The last story we're going to talk about today is The Hollows of Time, written by previous script editor Christopher H. Bidmead. Again, this story has been adapted by Big Finish into an audio play, but as of yet there is no Target novelisation. So the Doctor and Peri have visited the Reverend Maxwell in the small English village of Hollowdene. It all seems fine at first, but much like the villagers, the Doctor and Peri start to forget things. At the same time, the villagers have a new leader, a character called Professor Stream. Now, I mean, come on, it's obvious. Christopher H. Bidmead is well known for using anagrams in all of his stories, pretty much. So what's an anagram of Stream? Oh yeah, the Master. It's the Master. So the Master is using another monster seen in Doctor Who before, the Dractators, to create hollows or wormholes through time, much like a woodlouse would burrow through sand. Now this is all causing the memory loss of the villagers and the Doctor. This was sort of a very wormhole, time-bending anomaly heavy plot. I think it would have been quite a lot to fully understand. I wouldn't oppose seeing the Dractators again, as I think Frontios was one of the better stories from season 21. Bidmead also has experience writing The Master, as he wrote Legopolis and Castrovalva, and I quite like the way The Master was written in those stories. What's interesting to me is the way The Master's written in this one appears to be very Delgado-esque. So it would have been interesting to see Anthony Ainley play with that sort of version of the Master. So to wrap it all up, despite these stories and this season never officially existing, I feel like it's still very part of the Doctor Who mythos. These stories are still considered canon by many fans, me included. And thanks to the Big Finish versions and the Target books, we're still able to experience some of these adventures, and obviously that's why. Maybe these stories would have turned out completely different if they had eventually made it to screen. But that's the thing, we're never going to know. But that's okay, because we still have these stories, in expanded media. It's always great to discuss and think what would have been, and Doctor Who's one of the great shows that we can do that with. I mean, just think we're extremely lucky that these stories never actually happened, but yet we still have the material to somewhat enjoy. If you enjoyed what you saw here today, feel free to subscribe for similar content. If there was a particular video or section of the video you liked, let me know by liking or commenting on the video. Your likes and comments could influence the next topic I talk about. Thanks for watching.